I'm coming to you today from the Joshua Judges and Jesus Museum at the Bible Seminary. We're looking forward to the time of year when we celebrate the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, and that's what I want to talk to you about today. We have multiple ancient sources outside the New Testament who tell us about Jesus of Nazareth: Suetonius, Tacitus, Pliny, Josephus, and others. A couple of them even mention that he was crucified under Pontius Pilate. Suffice it to say that Jesus was a real historical person and that he died in the spring of AD 33 in Jerusalem. Let's talk about his death, burial, and resurrection. I have in front of me some artifacts that pertain to the death of Jesus. We see a replica of the type of whip with which he was scourged. We see a crown of thorns like that which would have been placed on Jesus's head. We see a nail that is 11.5 centimeters long, and the reason that is important because we actually have excavated crucifixion victims with the nails still in their wrists and still in their ankles. In all the instances, they're 11.5 centimeters. The nails were not intended to keep the body on the cross. The Romans used ropes for that. The nails were intended to inflict maximum pain, and that's what Jesus endured. The Bible also says that he was plunged in the side with a spear like this one. He wore garments which the soldiers gambled for. A fibula or toga pin like this would have held it. The soldiers would have gambled with a die like this, which is an actual first century die. We know that Jesus died on Friday of Passover week in the spring of AD 33. About noon, as he'd already been on the cross for 3 hours, the Bible says that darkness covered the land for the next 3 hours. This was likely a sandstorm, which is common in that part of the world, that had come up that brought darkness about over the land. People would have realized, though, that something was up. In fact, when Jesus was buried, there was another phenomenon that took place. Not only did Jesus die, he also was buried. And the Bible is very clear about this. In order to be a Christian, one must believe in the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. So let me explain to you how burial practices were in the late Second Temple period. Prior to the 1st century BC, when a person died, the body was placed into a tomb carved into bedrock. There was a bench. After 1 year, when the body had decomposed, the bones were gathered and then placed in a repository underneath that bench. The next family member would go through the same process. You could have multiple skeletal remains all piled up. So we read in the Old Testament that he was gathered to his fathers, and that's kind of the picture that we have. But it all changed in about 63 BC. When the local Jewish population, as a result of a wave of ritual purity in response to the Roman occupation, began to practice secondary burial. I have in front of me an ossuary from the time of Jesus. When somebody died in the time of Jesus, what they did was to place the body on a bench within a tomb. When it decomposed after a year, they would gather the bones, and instead of placing them into a repository, they would place them into an ossuary like this. Now, this is for a child. There are ossuaries of all sizes, and they're just long enough for the femur bone, the longest bone in our body. Thousands of these have been found in Israel, and about 25% of them have inscriptions on them. Had Jesus stayed in the grave, when his body decomposed, his bones would have been gathered together into a box just like this. But of course, Jesus didn't cooperate with the whole death program, and that's what we'll talk about next. At 3 p.m., Jesus took his last breath. He cried out, "It is finished." At that moment, the veil of the temple was torn in two. Quickly, the body of Jesus had to be buried. Joseph of Arimathea obtained permission from Pontius Pilate. They quickly removed the body from the cross and wrapped it, cleaned it, and prepared it for burial. This perhaps took an hour to 2 hours. It has to be before sundown because Passover is about to begin. They take the body of Jesus, they lie it into this tomb at a place called Golgotha, which had been a stone quarry in the 1st century. They roll the stone in front of the tomb, and then go to prepare for the Passover. As the sun sets and dusk begins, Shabbat begins, Passover begins. On the horizon, there is a blood moon rising. It's April 3rd, AD 33. We now know astronomically, NASA can confirm this, that there was a lunar eclipse visible in Jerusalem, and it's what we would call a blood moon that day. An inescapable sign to the local inhabitants that something important had happened. You see, ancient people looked to celestial phenomenon to understand God's pleasure or displeasure about certain matters. No wonder Peter stood up 50 days later on the day of Pentecost, and in his sermon, he quoted Joel chapter 2. He talked about the sun turning into darkness and the moon into blood, and that it had just been fulfilled. So we see even nature was confirming that the Son of God had died that day. But he didn't stay in the grave very long. In fact, on the third day, on Sunday morning, on Easter morning, Jesus came out of the grave. We have the Shroud of Turin, which is an amazing artifact which shows us a crucifixion victim from the first century with a supernatural imprint on it. This person had a crown of thorns and a spear in the side, had piercings in the wrists, had piercings in the feet, and had clearly been beaten. This is very likely the burial cloth of Jesus of Nazareth. Scientists cannot today explain how that imprint was made. But we have more. This is what we call the Nazareth inscription because it was found in Nazareth in the 1870s. This is an imperial decree of either Tiberius Caesar or Claudius Caesar issuing the death penalty by crucifixion for anyone who steals bodies from graves in Palestine. It seems like there was a problem with bodies disappearing from graves in Palestine in the 30s AD. Think about what Matthew 27:51 through 53 says. When Jesus came out of the grave, many others came out of their graves at that same time and were seen walking around the holy city. You see, Easter's not just about one empty tomb. It's about hundreds of empty tombs. The power of resurrection to bring him back to life and therefore to bring us back to life as well. As an archaeologist, historian, and theologian, I can tell you there is no doubt that there was a historical Jesus, that he existed in the first century just as the Bible tells us. I can also tell you that he died by crucifixion, when he died, where he died, and how he died. What I cannot prove to you is that he died in your place. You see, that's a work of the Spirit. That's a work of faith. I hope as you consider the evidence that I've shown you today, that you'll also consider the fact that Jesus wasn't just a historical reality, and that he died in your place, he was buried in your place, and he was raised from the dead in your place.